First, again, my name is Kyle Feingold, founder or co-founder of Guiding Bright Minds, and we are here today at our webinar series. We are at webinar number 10. The webinar series started in November. In today's webinar, ADHD and executive functioning, from surviving to thriving in middle school. And we have Roxanne Turner, board certified coach here to talk with us. And Roxanne, I'll just say, man, it's hard enough to survive through middle school. So I can't wait to hear the tips you have for all of us in order to go from surviving to thriving. So thanks, Roxanne, for being here. Before I hand it over to her and officially introduce you to Roxanne, I want to give you some background on Guiding Bright Minds. So my wife and I co-founded Guiding Bright Minds last November, and our journey really began from personal experiences that resulted in the creation of Guiding Bright Minds. So for me, my experience started in school, like so many maybe of you and of your kids. So I struggled mightily in school and was diagnosed with dyslexia in the 5th grade, and I had undiagnosed ADHD. And if I was given an assessment in today's environment back when I was a kid, I'm sure I would have been diagnosed with sensory processing deficits as well. So as you can imagine, school is difficult for me, particularly if you rewind 30 years. Think about what school looked like back then. School was really difficult for me. Teachers didn't know how to reach me, and I struggled. And not only did I struggle, my parents struggled. And they struggled watching me. And really, they worked so hard to find the resources and the right paths to help me be successful. And I give the world to what my parents went through and all the struggles that they had, and help finding me what I needed as a child. So with all of that said, and I go back now from today, 17 years ago, I started a tutoring and academic coaching company or an organization in 2004. And Results Learning is the name of the organization, and it specializes in ADHD, executive functioning, dyslexia, and diverse learners. And the reason why I started this organization was truly because of my experience and my passion. And for the last 17 years, I've had the pleasure of working with these incredible out-of-the-box neurodiverse learners. And today, my wife and I, we're raising an incredible neurodiverse learner ourselves. And, really, we know the joy and the pain of watching our children struggle. And we're watching my child struggle right now, socially and academically, despite all of his amazing gifts. And really, my wife and I wanted to create an organization that supports and helps parents through their journey with their diverse learner. And we know that there's nothing more painful for parents, my parents, us, you, than seeing your child struggle. So we've created a community that brings parents, professionals, educators, and nonprofits together to embrace, empower, and celebrate our children. So our community at Guiding Bright Minds was created by parents for parents. So what is Guiding Bright Minds? Well, Guiding Bright Minds is a single destination resource for parents of diverse and neurodiverse learners that connects them with screened and vetted schools and professionals, educates parents on symptoms and diagnosis and treatments for learning and neurodiversities, and unites parents and families with others who share similar experiences. So Guiding Bright Minds, we believe that all children who learn differently have incredible talents and strengths that we like to call superpowers. Look, today we're on the ground floor of this effort, and we want to build this for you and with you as a community who believes that diverse learners are incredible. So I'm going to include a link to the Guiding Bright Minds website in the chat, as well as a link for you to sign up to our newsletter as Roxanne begins her talk. I encourage you to check out our community. There's no cost to sign up to be a part of our community, and certainly we invite you at least to sign up for our newsletter. Our newsletter, through our newsletter, you'll receive invitations to our webinars that we host every 2 weeks, our new vlogs that we produce every 2 weeks, our blogs and our articles, all around focused on raising and supporting neurodiverse learners. So with that, we host, as I said earlier, we host a webinar every 2 weeks. Our next webinar, 2 weeks from today, is called the Top 10 Strategies for Parenting Children with ADHD and Executive Functioning. kind of piggybacking on our topic today. The date for that is May 19th. It's at 12 p.m., same time. And our guest speaker will be Cindy Goldrich, founder of PST Coaching. So before I introduce Roxanne, I just want to say one more time that we're going to send you a recording of this webinar and a link to Guiding Bright Minds tomorrow as a follow-up to today's topic. So again, our topic today, ADHD and executive functioning, from surviving to thriving in middle school. So I want to introduce you to Roxanne Turner. So Roxanne has over 20 years in teaching, training, and facilitating personal development. She's a board-certified life coach with extensive training in ADHD and the process of getting things done. Roxanne brings a unique and personal perspective to her coaching work, including work in both the corporate and equestrian worlds, and from which she applies outside of the box approaches as she works with people's strengths, processes, and learning styles to help her clients reach their full potential. So I have to say personally, Roxanne, I've known Roxanne for I think 7 or 8 years now.
Yes, wow.
Roxanne truly works from really a mission-driven, vulnerable, and real perspective. And she lives and breathes this mission every day. I can call Roxanne to talk about something completely different, and it always comes back to this because she truly loves, lives, and breathes this. And, you know, honestly, my relationship with Roxanne and some of our conversations was really one of the inspirations that helped my wife and I find Guiding Bright Minds. So Roxanne, thanks for just being a colleague and a friend over these last several years. And I'm really excited to hand it off to you for 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, and then we're gonna end it with some Q&A. So Roxanne, thanks again for being here, and it's all yours.
Well, my pleasure, and thanks for having me, and thank you parents out there for being here and spending your time, as we know that's your most sacred commodity. I am going to ask 2 things. One, if you're like me and believe in the mission of Guiding Bright Minds, is I would also ask, I know there's the newsletter and that you can share with other families and providers, that if you could subscribe the YouTube channel as well and share that with folks so we can get this messaging out to more people. And as you know, it's all about the numbers. So if you could hit that subscribe button, that would be huge. And then, so in the chat, I would love an answer to this question. So do I have permission to be pretty candid and honest with you? So if I could get some yeses so I know you're out there, that would be really helpful. Rockin', that's awesome. Thank you so much.
Lots of yeses coming in.
Yes, which is just what I need. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. All right. You can see everything okay, Kyle? Okay, great. Okay, so the first thing I want to give you is kind of my perspective in terms of where I'm coming from in this presentation. I'm going to be giving Kyle a list of different resources that I'm going to be mentioning today, as well as some other of my favorites. So you always have that as a point of reference. So I'm always looking at it from the lens that kids want to do well if they can. And when things aren't going well, or maybe there's some behavioral challenges, that I'm coming from a lack or lagging skill perspective. And I also want to give you an idea of what's going on from a brain standpoint when your kid hits adolescence, which usually happens between the ages of 10 and 14. And throughout the presentation, providing some additional kind of survival/thriving tips for you. So ready or not, here it comes, right? Even with some of our kids with ADHD, there's a 3 to 5 year delay, but when that adolescence hits, it happens. And you can survive, right? And a big part of this is understanding when adolescence happens, their brain is not our brain. It is very different, and we're coming from 2 very different perspectives. And as some of you probably already know, is that they're run by emotions. That rational thinking hasn't happened yet, and I'll have some slides that kind of explain in more detail why that is. So it's messy. I liken it to controlled chaos, right? Not always a whole lot of rainbows, daisies, and unicorns, that it can be really challenging. as well as actually can be a really an amazing, fun time. All right, so in my mind, to parent, you're exhausted. I'd be curious if any of you, what your thoughts are on this, but I kind of liken it to 3 kinds of exhaustion that we have a choice. 1, where the kid runs the show and we're always chasing after them. 2, where we're trying to manage every aspect of their day, right? Just trying to control everything. And then 3, right, which is what Guiding Bright Minds is about, is how do we develop these young people into these amazing, responsible, healthy adults? In all honesty, your kids are the ones that give me hope. There are future change makers, there are leaders, there are future entrepreneurs, CEOs, that they're thinking about things in a different way. And part of our job as the adults in their life is how do we keep that spark alive? And you know, one of the things that Dr. Barkley, Russell Barkley, he's kind of, I liken him to the godfather of ADHD, is one of the things he really talks about is that loving our kids, right? Always putting in that emotional piggy bank. Because there are times when we're a parent that we might have to provide constructive feedback or there's consequence we have to take away, but that we're always letting them know that they do have that unconditional love. So the other part, right, with our kids going to school, those social engagements, it has a different meaning. So when they come home, that's their safe place. So that's where the meltdowns happen, because all of that self-regulation of trying to hold it together in these environments that aren't necessarily always designed for them, you get to see the ugly, right? So there's a part to that, and that there is a cost, which I would recommend going back to, I think it was the webinar from 2 weeks ago with the Temple Grandin School, where they do talk about that self-care and how important that is. And the other reason, you know, in terms of parenting and being a parent, you're walking this tightrope of how do I support my kiddo and my teen so they are in becoming that interdependent person, right? What I mean by that is becoming self-reliant, but also knowing how to be resourceful, using the community, using the people in their life to assist with the things maybe they're not so good at yet, versus teaching that learned helplessness. And I don't know about you, but that's not something that I'm looking to do. And so the other thing I always like to think of as being a parent, some friends of ours, we do a lot of outdoor adventure stuff in our family, that there's 3 kinds of fun. There's level 1 fun, that it's fun in the moment and it's fun to talk about. Level 2 fun, it's not so much fun in the moment, but it's fun to talk about later. And level 3 fun, which is not fun in the moment and you don't want to talk about it. And I see being a parent as a lot of a level 2 fun. And it's those level 1 funs of that it's fun in the moment and fun to talk about that keeps bringing us back. So I love this slide. It's an old family circus. And it's where Billy's mom is asking him to take the mail to the mailbox. Mom's expectation, it's going to be a nice straight line. He's going to get there before the mailman. Billy's like, I'm all in. You got it, Mom. Well, Billy doesn't go in a straight line. Oops, I missed the mailman. So my question always is to parents, excuse me, is Billy wrong? And I would argue, no, he's not. He just did it different. And as some of you have probably already experienced, your kids find a different way to do it. And I also want to, I guess, remind you that you are the expert in your kid. You know your kid, which means that sometimes your parenting style isn't gonna be in a straight line. And going straight line isn't always the best way. So you need to parent the kid that you have, even if the Jones is over here, it looks a little bit different. And I've met some amazing families, some amazing kids where it has looked very different and they've been okay. I mean, much like Kyle, I was that kid. And I definitely took a very different path, as Kyle alluded, from horses to corporate to coaching. That is definitely not a straight line. So I just also want to give you some perspective, right, in terms of it's where they are today isn't a reflection of where they'll be tomorrow. I'll include in the resources, there's an article in, I think it's Attitude Magazine with Michael Phelps's mom. Well, the reason she threw him in the pool is because he was driving her crazy, right? He was nonstop bundle of energy and she just didn't know what to do. So she threw him in the pool. But ironically, he didn't like to get his face wet. So his first stroke he learned was the backstroke. And we know what a successful career he's had and what an amazing human being he's turned to be. And another favorite story is Richard Branson, right? He's an entrepreneur, but his mom tells a story about how I think he was like 6 or 7. He was being really mischievous in the car. He was super shy, and a big value for her was having self-reliant kids. So a mile from his grandparents' house, she kicked him out of the car and said, "Find your way," right? And she knew he was going to be safe. Well, he found his way, but she didn't take into the account that he was going to look under like every rock, look for every bug, like kind of go all over the place, right? Kind of that journey, but he learned how to be self-reliant to get to his grandparents' house. So, adolescence. I took a training with through PESI with Dr. George McCloskey, and I love the way he kind of explains it. So when adolescence happens, we're going to talk about the brain science in a couple slides, but just imagine that you've got nepotism at its finest. And you've got this VP that has taken over the brain, completely unqualified, has no idea what's going on, doesn't really know how to do anything, sort of a little bit inept, but thinks they know everything, right? I got it, right? So that's who you're dealing with. But unfortunately, you can't fire him, right? They're there to stay. So we have to figure out, how are we going to teach? How are we going to influence? How are we going to coach? How are we going to train this kind of unqualified VP that's now taken over our kid? And I assure you, your child has not been possessed by aliens. It is a healthy developmental process, right? Through adolescence. It truly is an amazing time, but it can prove challenging. That's usually when you start hearing words of, oh, they're really resistant. Well, that's where we have to ask as the adults, well, why are they resistant? Is it because they're no longer as compliant and they're not doing what we want them to do? Right? And so I think both in Craig's, Nippenberg's, and then Elaine with Impact ADHD webinar, they kind of talked about that coach approach. How are you having that conversation? And one of my favorite, absolute favorite, and it is in the resources, is motivational interviewing, because it teaches you how to roll with that resistance. Right? It is my favorite survival tip, and it is so much fun because they're not expecting you to roll with it when they push back. Like some of that pushback, no, I don't want to do it that way. Okay, they're not expecting that. And then that's where you kind of come up with ideas and you're putting it in their bucket in terms of how are they going to do that. And one thing to think about is that there is some, obviously peers start to become more important, very important, but that you still have that relationship. There's a difference between kind of pushing away and having some healthy separation versus completely shutting you out, right? You still are a very important and vital role. And then one of the other things I always like to think about, sorry, I just lost my train of thought, is that, which you'll see in the next slide, is from an executive function standpoint, especially in middle school, that's usually when we see the words of like the resistance, the planning, the disorganized book backpack, missing deadlines. Those are very complex executive skills and are kind of a combination of them. So again, it's looking at, well, what's missing and again, we have this VP, right? Serious nepotism. We got to figure out what's in it for them. What's in it for them so that they can do what they don't really want to do so they can get to the part where they want to. And I think in the Brainstorm book, Dr. Siegel quotes or references a quote from Mark Twain, and I think it's still applicable today, which was, "When I was a boy at 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years." Well, I know we're all already kind of experiencing that. And that's, again, why I'm such a big believer in guiding bright minds, because it does take a community. So sharing this message with those others in their lives, like their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents, the more they can understand and share your values, and getting the same information from someone else is really beneficial. So the other part, in terms of when all these things come online and all these things are happening to our kids, they're kind of also struggling. Like for me, middle school, yuck, not a fan. So like this 7th grader is like, you know, all these things are happening. I have no idea. My mood's all over the place, hormones, like I'm starting to look different. Everybody, I don't want to be Waldo anymore, right? I want to look the same. I want to be the same. And then you're asking me to focus? Like, that's a lot to ask. I remember an 8th grader saying to me, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get to high school, because then I know who my friends are going to be, right? Because he's like, one day to the next, I don't know who's going to be my buddy. And things like feeling like they have no choices, and feeling like everybody's always trying to control all aspects of their lives. So I think it's just kind of keeping that in mind, that, right, when you enter middle school, like, that's a whole new world, and a whole lot is going on, and that self-realization, thinking, oh, I'm supposed to worry about how I look, right, comes into effect. I'm going to take a little pause. I'd be curious to hear kind of what kind of your feedback or takeaways are so far. I'm hoping, are my slides changing?
Yeah, I think so, Roxanne.
Okay.
So, Roxanne just asked for some feedback around what have you learned, or what was a takeaway so far. And if anybody does not see a slide titled Active Perspective, just go ahead and say, just please let us know.
You don't see it. So if there was a question regarding adolescence delayed in kids with ADHD, there's aspects of it, right? Yes and no. It all kind of depends. Like sometimes that self-awareness can take longer in terms of connecting those dots. Oh, thank you. I see some. And you'll see also, as it relates to executive function, in a slide that I'll have in a couple minutes, in terms of that brain development. Because unfortunately, as we develop, it's not like a stair step. It's kind of like ready or not, like, we could be developing these skills, and then adolescence hits from a hormone, or our brain starts to reorganize. Like, it's sort of like that hierarchical approach, if that makes sense. Okay.
Great. And one person said, I like the goal of creating a self-reliant but resourceful child.
Yes.
Feedback.
Which, right, is that's the ultimate goal, but it's not always the easiest thing to do. Creating self-thinkers, it's exhausting. It does take some effort.
And one person said they love the metaphor of the VP. So
that's awesome.
Yes.
All right. So for older high school students, what tools are there? So I'll address that question regarding, so real quick, in terms of motivational ideas, motivational interviewing, I have a book. It's kind of short and sweet. Most of the books I will include are short and sweet, but it's Rolling with Resistance. And I think the biggest thing is letting them reject your ideas, right? That it's okay and it's not personal. That if they think your idea is like garbage, that's okay. Well, tell me what you don't like about it, and let's come up with something else. And that's the big piece. So one of the big things was sleep. I mean, this can be a webinar in and of itself, but just to understand that they do turn into night owls, and that there's biology behind that. Anywhere between the ages of 10 to 12, the melatonin that tells them it's time to go to sleep can get released like up to 2 hours later. And then when they wake up, there's sort of a reason why they're like these sloths, because the melatonin stays in their system even longer. So that's the point where routines are super duper important, and that sleep hygiene, right? And I know you guys have probably heard a lot about it, but that's where modeling as parents is going to be important. I know every household does it differently, but when our kids were younger, they're long gone and in college, we had a no screens rule because sleep was so important, and that applied to the adults in the house as well. Because, right, that VP, they notice all the hypocrisy, right? So that's where as adults, we have to own it because we're creating these critical thinkers, so they're going to be thinking about that. And so that's also where that morning routine, the less thinking everybody has to do, the better. And I think one of my favorite examples was I was at a Denver CHAD, I was facilitating a meeting, and a parent pulled me aside and said, I'm really worried about my 10-year-old daughter. And I was like, okay, what's going on? Well, she's late to school every day. My wife drives her, so then she's late to work, and so they're constantly fighting. I'm like, okay. And then he's like, well, she came up with a solution that she would just go to bed in her school clothes. Like she'd take a shower, get dressed in her school clothes, and go to bed. And then she would wake up, eat breakfast, brush her teeth, and out she went. My wife thought it was a great idea because they were no longer fighting and she was no longer late for work. But I'm really worried. Okay, what are you worried about? Well, what if she thinks that this is normal, and then when she's like out of college and she goes to interview and her clothes are wrinkly? She's 10. I'm like, I think she'll be okay, right? Right now, we need to celebrate the fact that she solved a problem. She knew her mom was pissed, right? Her mom's just infuriated because they're always late and like the domino effects. So she solved the problem. That's where we start. Middle school will most likely, in high school, will start to take care of the wrinkly clothes on its own. So enjoy it while you can, that they're not so worried about that. And again, she solved that problem. So one of the big challenges, I know, especially for kids with ADHD, sleep is a challenge. So I am, so figuring that out, like if the meltdowns seem excessive, the behavior just seems really bad, first place to start, how's that sleep going, right? And if your kid is taking medication, is that potentially affecting it, right? These are important conversations to have with your doctor. That's where, you know, screen hygiene, weighted blankets, and experimenting with things. And I know that's a big challenge for our kids. All right. So here is my favorite, and I'll have a link to it, and it's New York Times, and it has a sliding scale. So I'm just focusing on the 13-year-old brain to the 21-year-old brain. So the green, as you notice, right, that's that frontal lobe. That's where all those executive functioning, those critical thinking things, skills are sitting, is green, which means it's not completely online yet. So with adolescence, what's really interesting is that there's a huge, it's not a hormone thing per se, just a thing, but the whole brain is reorganizing, which I think is just fascinating, which is why, you know, our brains develop from back to front. But during adolescence, this front part of the brain can take up to the mid-20s, late 20s to develop, especially with our kiddos with ADHD, that there's this 3 to 5 year delay, but they're mostly thinking in the back of their head, which is why sometimes as parents, we're like, wait a minute, I don't really understand why you're so upset about this, right? Because hopefully our frontal lobe is online. Well, theirs isn't. They're sitting in the back of their head. So that's where we have to come up with strategies of when we do have that meltdown, what do we do, right? Because they don't know how to regulate or modulate. And with a lot of our kiddos, especially with ADHD, that emotional control, that self-regulation can be a really big challenge. So what are some things that you can do? So for example, it's thinking ahead. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Ross Greene's work, right? Is planning ahead so you guys have a game plan. And one of the things that you can do, like for example, with one 8th grader I worked with a long time ago, he got really upset because he needed extra time to do this test. He knew everybody was going to go to Starbucks. he was really worried that he wasn't going to get to go because he was going to still be taking this test, and he got himself pretty upset. So after the fact, we realized what it was all about, and we found a solution. But we started talking, and I was like, well, do you find that you get upset a lot? And he's like, yes. And he explained that it kind of went in these stages. And so we kind of came up with note cards, and we sat down with mom. Well, what happens in stage 1? Well, I just feel a little sick in my stomach. Okay, what do you want mom to do? Well, I'll just let her know I'm feeling a little sick in my stomach, and maybe she could ask what's up, right? And then what's stage 2? Well, I start getting really, really upset, right? What do you need mom to do? Just sit with me until I can calm myself down. So we literally wrote out the cards. So when this started happening, he didn't have to explain anything to mom. He could just give the information to mom, which then you're teaching this kind of self-awareness, but you're not asking for these extra pieces of having to kind of explain in the moment when we're a hot mess. It's really hard to explain yourself when you're like really upset, right? It's kind of that after effect. And the other piece, right, with teenage brains, that they're seeking novelty, right? They're looking for that dopamine. They're looking for doing things new, kind of like showing their independent muscles. They want to do it different than you. So it's not about squashing it. And I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges as adults, is we, just as much as our kids have to keep a growth mindset, we have to keep a growth mindset, right? And that we don't have a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, that's really different. That's not how I would do it. We got to find out, what are they thinking? How are we going to channel this kind of energy and the things that they want to do? So I love this slide. So the red, right, kind of talks about how do we learn through our lifetime. And when we're young, it's all about experience, right? Like I don't know if you know, Kyle, but I don't know how old people were when they decided to cross the ocean when they thought the world was flat to come find America. But I've got to imagine that they were young and they had ADHD, and they're like, this is a really good idea. Let's see what happens, right? Here we are. I mean, that's the one thing I haven't looked at, but that's one thing I've always just sort of thought about. So it is that experience. And I think, that's the part where COVID's been a little hard on our kids, because our kids are designed to go out and do things and experience things. And that's how we learned. And that has been suppressed, right? To some extent, let's just be honest about it. So how do we kind of re-engage that, where they're going out and they're experiencing things and trying things out in a healthy way, right? Because obviously as we get older, we have to work a little harder to create those new experiences for ourselves. Now, this is the part that's so exciting about these adolescent brains, that they are really these like smushy things, right? We keep that neuroplasticity, but they're learning at this amazing rate, right? They're shedding the old gray matter, the stuff they don't need anymore. They're laying down all this new myelin sheath, this new connectivity. And that's why those experiences are so important. The more experiences, bigger the neurons get, right? The faster things start moving. And as we get older, right? When we want to make changes, we can still do it, but it takes a little more effort, right? A little more intention, a little more mindfulness, right? So that's watching these kids. It's an opportunity through practice and repetition, and it's a lot more than you think it is. It's amazing what they can do and set an example for us. Before I go to the next bit, is there any other kind of takeaways at this moment? Or I didn't know if you saw any questions, Kyle, that you think I should answer.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to direct questions to Q&A.
Okay.
So as you get to the questions, or as you have questions, as you're listening, please drop those in the Q&A. But Roxanne, you wanted to get right now some takeaways, right, that people have so far?
I'd just be kind of curious in terms of that brain development. The rigid thinker, but this is great. Okay, well, thank you for that feedback. Well, then I'll just keep rocking because I know some of the questions I see in here, I do answer in a future slide.
Yep.
Um,
And Roxanne, I just can't
Yeah.
emphasize enough. I think you pointed out something great in terms of the brain development and then the repetition of getting these new habits, skills, or routines, right? And can't emphasize enough that it takes a lot of repetitions. 66 to 254 is what we always like to say. So it's not just a few repetitions, it is a lot of repetitions of success and learning through failure.
Exactly, which is my next slide. But I do want to kind of tell a story in terms of one of my favorite strategies that I use with my stepsons. I got married later in life. I know that's hard to believe, but I did. I wish I could see faces. I don't know how my jokes are landing. But anyhow, I remember they were both in middle school and they had been playing at a friend's house, asked them to be home at 6. They showed up at 6, went running through the door, basically yelling about how they wanted to stay at their friend's house for dinner, but they know I would never allow it. And just this big loud hurricane that came through the door. Well, why wouldn't I say no? That's really easy. And I really didn't appreciate how I was being spoken to, nor did I particularly appreciate that I was being told the answer to the question, right? I'm just kind of funny that way. So I asked them, well, we have a choice here. I can just do what's easy because you already told me I'd say no. So I could just go with that. Or we could try this again. And they're like, oh, let's try this again. So they made them go outside the door and they thought I was ridiculous. They came back in, they tried it again. I was like, okay, that was better, but could I give you a tip or two so we can get to with the answer that you want, which is yes. So made them go back out again. They came in, said, hey, we're having a great time. They asked that we could stay for dinner. Is that something that we could do? And we could be home around 10 o'clock, right? It was the summertime. Not a big deal. That was an easy yes, right? So it was just more of giving them an opportunity to practice how they approach me, right? That delivery, like Craig and Elaine talk about our delivery to our kids, but our kids need to know how to deliver to us, right? If we want these VPs to get what they want, they also need to know how to talk to us and how they're training us. So that's kind of one of my favorites in terms of, I consider that a thriving, because it's, for me, I know it's my perspective, it's kind of fun, right? To play with them, make me want to say yes. Like I used to make jokes about the fact that I love no because it requires no effort on my part, right? And so I always said, make me want to say yes, give me a reason, ask better questions, like tell me what I want to know, because no is easy and I'm really tired and I'd rather just do no. So that's kind of one of the games I like to play. So the other big thing, I do want to talk about that one that came up. Sorry, I got distracted. So first attempt in learning failure. Please, pretty please, I beg of you, be okay with that. I know as a parent, it is so hard. It is so hard to watch your kids be uncomfortable. It is so hard to watch that disappointment. But going back to that slide, that experience is where they can learn from that. It is so, so valuable. And you can teach them how to fail, right? Because failure is an opportunity to learn. And oftentimes, when kids make mistakes, we might hit them with the book versus, whoa, the behavior doesn't reflect who they are as a person. They just did something kind of maybe dumb. So where's the opportunity or the lesson in that, right? Depending on what it is, like as parents, sometimes we might be really pissed. So we might not be able to address it in the moment. And trust me, I have had plenty of situations where I've had to say, especially when they were teenagers, I can't talk to you. I can't even discuss this right now because I'm so angry. We're going to talk about this tomorrow and come up with something that's appropriate, right? So that way we could talk about what happened, why it wasn't okay, and what's an appropriate consequence to that. Even something, right, which is going to that natural consequence, which is big. Like something as simple as like you're going to go for a hike and you know it gets cold in the late afternoons, evenings in Colorado when you're on the top of a 13er, right? And you say, well, you know, you might want to bring your jacket. And they're like, no, I don't want to bring my jacket. I don't need my jacket. Well, you could decide to do a power play or just go, I would love everybody to practice. Okay. Then when you get to that top of that 13er and they're complaining how miserable they are, this is the hard part, folks. Bite our tongue. I wonder why that is. Don't know. But you got to say nothing, because if you say, well, I told you so, well, then they have to take no responsibility. It's so easy to pass the buck to parental units, right? So let them own that cold, right? They're going to be okay. And then next time it rolls around and you're like, hey, we're going to go climb another 14, or you want to bring your jacket? I don't need my jacket. Oh, do you remember what happened last time? That's all you say. Go, and walk away. And some of them are going to take a couple times before it finally connects. Those dots connect. It gets cold on the top of a 13 or a 14er and the wind is blowing. So don't be afraid of those natural consequences. And this is I think, a really big one to keep in mind. Executive function, there was a comment earlier about backsliding, totally appropriate, and you will see it. I still remember, like in middle school, I thought, I got this, right? Like my kids are good. And then they hit like 14, 15. I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like they don't remember how to do this. So totally appropriate. It's not a nice, smooth process. You're going to go up and down, up and down. And that's the challenge of being a parent, is providing that consistency. Because a lot of times, you know, it's like, well, I tried it. It didn't work. Well, how many times did you try it? Did it work? Was there some success? Right? If it worked 50% of the time, should you just keep trying it? Right? As Kyle said, it can take up to a year. That's like amazing teachers, right? That have done amazing things with your kid, that you might actually not see the results of that till the next year. Just to keep that into perspective. I have had young men that I've worked with when they were in high school, and now they're off to college. And I remember they said to me, they're like, well, you know, some of that stuff, it just didn't resonate. But now that I'm like 19 going on 20, it kind of makes sense. And I actually use it. So be prepared for that. Kind of like that Mark Twain quote, right? They're like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And then one day, well, maybe you knew a thing or two. So don't be surprised. And when that backslide happens, hey, what's up? What can I do to help? That can make a huge, huge difference. And I do want to mention this before I saw a chat about self-regulation and electronic devices. No, I'm going to be super direct. No, unless they prove otherwise. But in general, I mean, as adults, how much self-regulation do we demonstrate? How many times have we watched binged Netflix, like intentionally, versus just letting it happen? So with that self-regulation, just the way the brain is developed, I would say no. That's where you have to have that conversation. If they're like, I got this, okay, well, tell me how I know that you've got this. What does that look like, right? Is it an hour? So I think the best example I can give in terms of what that looked like, my boys know I hate devices. I hate video games. Like I just was salty about them when they were especially in middle school. It was just too much of a topic of conversation. So I said, here's the deal. You can prove me wrong. And so we came up with a list of chores, timelines. They came up with it. They came up with the consequence if they didn't follow through. We agreed that I would give them a checkpoint, right? Call them before I was heading home so they knew exactly how much time I had before I came home. And was I shocked when I came home and saw their little tookuses on the couch with wrappers everywhere and nothing done? No. So I was like, oh, sucks for you guys. Now we have to follow through. So in that case, they agreed. They had decided the consequence was no devices for 2 weeks, right? But we came up with that together. But then when they didn't follow through, it wasn't me rubbing their noses in it. It was just like, okay, well, here it is. Now let's play it out with the rest of the consequences. And two, on almost all the devices, but I know with the iPhones, they have screen time. That's a great conversation. If kids are getting frustrated, I'm not getting anything done. Well, let's look at the screens. You guys can compare, right? Again, keeping things on, like looking that there is no hypocrisy, right? Being really honest, and then, oh, yeah, we both could do a better job at being off our phones. So you can use downtime, you can use different stuff and have experiments, right? You don't want the technology to own you. It has a purpose and it has a place, but that's where teaching your kids how to use the technology appropriately. And why does all this matter? Because, you know, at the end of the day, if we're doing everything for them, they just think that's the way it's supposed to be, and it is not. So one of the big things I do want to talk about, which, because I want to be mindful of time, is, oh, it's really small. Sorry about that. Is future thinking. I got this from Cognitive Connections. And so the concept that middle schoolers, right, they're thinking, they can think about 2-3 days out. So if they get a book report that's due in a month and they're thinking about it like a day or 2 days ahead of time, well, first consider yourself lucky, but it's developmentally appropriate that it's not even entering their time zone, right? Like, I am grateful when I've got college students that have gotten to the point where we're thinking 2 weeks out, right? So that's why the planning, those externalizing, some of the teachers have gotten really good at creating like these little milestones. But then this again is why that natural consequence, if your kid all of a sudden is like, oh my gosh, I have this paper to write, and they pull an all-nighter, right? We need to celebrate the fact that they decided that they're going to pull an all-nighter, that the deadline meant something, and then they actually turned it in. Like, that's phenomenal. And for some of our kids, that's really challenging. But then when they wake up and they're like, oh, I'm so tired, I pulled an all-nighter, they go to school. They still go to school. Like, it's going to be brutal on you, right? Trying to pull these slugs and sloths out and getting them to school, and then having to suffer through the school day. And then you're probably just going to get this grumpy beast when you come home. But say nothing. Oh my gosh, that was exhausting. That was awful. I never want to do that again. Catalyst moment. Oh, okay. Well, what would you like me to do next time? How can I support you? What would you like from me? And then you might have a conversation and a taking off point. So I do want to be mindful of time. I think the one big thing, 2 big slides I want to talk about is time. And for our kids with ADHD, a lot of them don't have that internal clock. And so this is what time looks like. There's no sense of time. It doesn't really mean anything. And I know people use, well, my kid can hyper focus on video games. That's $1 million technology, right? That's hitting into our dopamine. Like, there's a whole reason that's like that, right? In terms of that hyper focus. But even if you are teaching them how to play video games, how do you externalize their time, whether it's time timers or even something to teach them to start asking what time it is, and asking them, well, what time do you think it is? I don't know, 2 o'clock, and it's 1 o'clock. You have asked that question a couple of times, and you kind of start to get a sense of how far off they might be, and how can we start to narrow that gap, right, in terms of that. And not all students with ADHD have time blindness, because I know some that they know exactly, they sure know when school is over. Like, they are already out the door. And again, like, why does this matter? Because ultimately, in terms of procrastination that kids don't see in the future, don't have a sense of time, yes, it's about them, but it's more about what it does to us, right? It's really frustrating, especially if you've got soon to be college seniors and you have college applications. I think we sort of lose our minds because we know when those deadlines are, right? Like I talked about in that future thinking, they have no concept. They're doing it. I got all summer, I've got class, but you know what's coming. You know what the classes are coming. So again, it's that conversation using kind of big monthly planners right? Or sometimes there's external resources like teachers. Sometimes they start doing things around essays and Common Apps, which can help with the process. And the other big one I want to talk about is the eye roll. I love the eye roll. And you are going to get it in adolescence. And when like I mentioned, I got married in life later, and I used to be in sales, and so I was on the road. And I met this gentleman who was a middle school teacher and had all boys. I think he had like 3 or 4 boys. And I said, what advice do you have for me? And he gave me a laundry list. But my favorite was, when they roll their eyes at you, that means they heard you and you got them. They didn't like it, but if they roll their eyes and they go, ugh, whatever, and then they go do it, you got them. Like, you need to celebrate that. And I still remember to this day sitting at that front door, and I said something to my stepsons, and they rolled their eyes at me and said whatever and went off and did the task. I was ecstatic because I was officially a mom that day. So looking at that perspective a little differently. And then this is my other favorite. And I really do, that your kids are amazing. Some of them I've gotten to work with, some of you parents out there. But this young man who's now going to be a junior in college, and the thing, you know, academics has been a little bit all over the place, but he is an amazing human being. He took this picture when he was in high school. I think it was maybe his sophomore or junior year of high school. And I love it. I love what he did. I loved how he is as a human. And that's the biggest thing as parents, keeping in mind, what is amazing about your kid? Who are they as human beings, and how do we want to keep developing that? Again, looking at the process, that the product, right, which is the grade, which is how the school system works, what is the process behind it and the meaning? So that way they'll share if they bomb a test. Okay, what's up? What happened? Right? Like for example, especially with grades, I always just look at that as information. That is not a character flaw. If they're not doing the work, what's up? Or if my favorite, heads up on this one, if they're getting 100% on their math homework, but they're bombing all the tests, what's up with that? Well, I found out, I've learned the hard way with some of my students, when they're getting graded for completion, they're not getting any constant feedback of how they're doing or actually how they're understanding the content. So that tells us a lot about the grade, right? In terms of we didn't understand the content. And in terms of that final piece, again, with our kids, it is that constant kind of feedback loop, right? What are we doing right? They don't get to hear a lot of that. And then also, if they are doing something that's not appropriate, how do we coach them in the moment? I included an article by Mary Fowler, and it's called The Point of Performance. If you're only going to read one thing from today, read that, because it's about helping them in that moment and coming up with that game plan, especially from that social aspect, right? If they say things inappropriate, or maybe they get too loud because they don't quite know how to modulate their voices, how do you help them know when it is time to kind of lower their voice? Maybe it's a touch on the knee or something you've worked out together. As Kyle knows, I could talk about this topic forever and a lifetime. So you will get a whole laundry list. I just saw a note that says, what is the reading again? You'll get a whole laundry list of resources. And of course, feel free to ask me any other additional questions, but I so appreciate your time. And what you got for me?
Yeah, we've got some good questions coming in, Roxanne. Just thank you. And I'm just going to mention really quick a couple of the takeaways that I thought are great. And some people mentioned the eye roll, that they appreciated that. And I think that's a great way to look at it. An eye roll is a win, or a win. So I'm going to start it off with one question of my own, and that is, you know, you talked about the process of kind of basically letting go and letting our children learn from those experiences, leaving the code at home, or
Yep.
you know, and not responding in the heat of the moment. Do you have a tip or two you can give to parents on how to not respond in the heat of the moment and really step back to let their kids learn? Because that, from being a parent, I can tell you that's hard.
Well, it is hard. And I guess that's where channeling it and finding ways to do it. I mean, I'm biased. I love the outdoors. I love physical things. I talked about my equestrian background, working with animals, right? You learn a lot of hard lessons. And I can't even imagine what my parents, actually, my mom stopped going to horse shows because she said she wanted to vomit every time she watched me jump a jump because she saw a couple crashes. But it's where are those safe places where they can learn that. And I'm a big believer in physical, especially for all brains, but especially for ADHD brains, right? What are we going to do with all of that energy? And I think it is hard. But then also in the heat of the moment, right? When you do have to train or coach, but you're not in the right mindset, right? We're in the back of our heads because maybe it was just like one too many times, or you told them not to do it and they did it anyway. You are allowed to say, you know what? I am infuriated. I am so beyond angry right now because we had this conversation. I can't talk to you right now, but we're going to discuss this either later this evening at a set time or tomorrow. In terms of teaching them that you don't have to always kind of go at it right away, that you can take a pause and you can even ask them, you know what, I need you to think about it, but I need to step away because I'm not going to be at my best self right now.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you, Roxanne. So here's a few questions that came up that are in the Q&A. So one around evening routines. You mentioned you need all adults involved in their lives to keep the routines because it's very hard to work back and forth or to go back and forth. What are some of the routines that work that you've seen or some of the parents that you've worked with have shared with you, Roxanne?
Well, that's a hard question because every family is different, right? I think the question is, I always start with, well, what do you want it to look like, right? What do you think is a reasonable time for your family to go to bed, right? Like if you're a family, you're not having dinner till 8 o'clock, no judgment here, that's just kind of how you roll, then you have to think about what's a reasonable time to go to bed. And then what are the things that you could put into place? Is you're eating dinner at 8 o'clock, the transition that's when all the devices go away and you can read and you can draw, maybe you go for a walk, right? What are those other like things that you can do that are not so stimulating to kind of ease your way into transition to bed? Asking your kids, what do they want it to look like? What do they think it's appropriate, right? And they're like, well, I think I should have my phone and watch a TV. Okay, I understand that. We'll put that on the table. You know, you guys have the non-negotiables, right? Well, I got to decide if I'm okay with that. But let's talk about what are some other ideas to help calm you down, right? Like even I think we read through middle school because my husband has really good voices and is really creative. I wasn't allowed to read because I was boring. But like, what are those kind of maybe those little family traditions? Maybe it's a board game every once in a while. That's a really hard question to answer because I don't know what your family looks like, but I think it's thinking of what's your ideal, asking what their ideal is, and then kind of experimenting.
Awesome. And it is 1 o'clock, so I want to respect everybody's time. If anybody wants to stick around, Roxanne, if you have a few more minutes, we can spend a few more minutes answering questions. But officially, I just want to say thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time. And Roxanne, you gave us so many great takeaways today. And my goal for everybody leaving this would be to find one takeaway, one thing that really resonated, and give it 60 to 120 days and work super, super hard on it and see if you start to see a change that's a little bit more consistent. So Roxanne, thank you. And I encourage everybody to visit Guiding Bright Minds and check us out. So thank you so much. Also check out our YouTube, as Roxanne mentioned. And we really hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks for being here.